All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting in-depth review. Yes, this is where I take an RPG product and review the heck out of it. When I say in depth, I mean in depth. I will go chapter by chapter of everything in this book, tell you the things I like about it, tell you the things I don't like about it, and I will give a recommendation on whether or not I think it's worth purchasing. But I know quite a few people that don't want to sit through, an hour to an hour and a half just to figure out whether or not they want to buy a book. So I always start off by giving my recommendation at the beginning. If you're only here to figure out whether or not you want to buy this book, this is the part that you need to listen to. So I tend to separate people that buy RPG books into three different groups. You have players; these are people that generally don't DM or GM things. They are mostly a player. You have GMs or DMs, and those are the people that are going to be running the games, and they have different things that they need out of a book. And then the third group of people are what I call lore hounds. Lore hounds are people that are just interested in the subject. They like the lore that's built into the RPG product, or they just like the stories that are built in. There's a decent amount of those people there, so I'm going to give a recommendation for each different group. So let's dive into this. For those of you that didn't read the title, I am going to be reviewing the G.I. Joe role-playing game. Now, this is a role-playing game that was released by Renegade Studios. I recently did a review of the Power Rangers role-playing game, which actually uses the same underlying system. It's called the Essence system. So, a lot of things in the G.I. Joe role-playing game are going to feel relatively similar to the Power Rangers role-playing game because they use the same system. However, these are different beasts. And to be honest, it's something that I like. If you watched my Power Rangers RPG in-depth review, I did mention that I was a little upset with it. It wasn't quite as complete, and this one's a little bit different in that case. But let's get to the actual purchase recommendations. So, the first group, players. If you are an RPG player, you are planning on playing a character in a G.I. Joe campaign, this is a good book. I've already mentioned before, I have reviewed an Essence system game already, and I like this system. The Power Rangers RPG is a little bit rough. It's a little bit confusing to be able to run things in it. It's actually a little bit confusing to create a character in it because the book itself is not set up super well to be really easy to kind of read through and build a character out of, and it's a little bit incomplete. The G.I. Joe book is different, to be blunt. It still has some of the issues I have as far as like order of how things are introduced. Those still exist, but this feels like a much more complete system. As far as actually creating your character, it's going to be very similar to Power Rangers, where you choose an influence, you choose an origin, and then you choose your role. This is what I'm assuming is going to happen in every single Essence-based system. The big difference is going to be the influence and origins makes sense. Influences are effectively, if you're a D&D 5e player, an influence is effectively your background, and your origin is effectively your race. If you're thinking mechanically about how these things work, it's just what they are. Your role is going to be your class. And one of the issues I had with Power Rangers was the roles, they just didn't feel like complete roles. They didn't feel like complete classes. It's very different in this one. There are a grand total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 7 roles in this compared to the 6 that were introduced in Power Rangers. And the nice thing about these roles, each role has a focus, which is effectively a subclass. Each role has 3 different foci. That's the plural of focus, by the way. This has so much more in it that I find really, really fun and interesting. There's a little bit less piecemeal aspect. The Power Rangers role-playing game feels very much like almost a skill-based RPG mixed in with a class-based RPG. This is a little bit closer to that class-based RPG that you're going to be expecting if you've played things like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or any other class-based system. The roles themselves are unique enough that they're going to feel good playing them, and you're going to be able to create some really interesting, unique characters. But another thing that I really like about this system, specifically for players, is things in here are somewhat generic in the idea that they don't tell you specifically, okay, this is your AK-47 and it uses these specific bullets. No, they will give you kind of categories of equipment. They will give you categories of skills and things like that, where they kind of explain this is mechanically what it does and this is what it might infer. But you're allowed to really, really flavor these characters and come up with some really interesting things. So for a player, this is really cool. You can have people that choose the same role in the same party that just choose different foci, and they will still feel unique. Whereas in Power Rangers, you can't have two people that are the same color. It doesn't work in the game system. So yeah, overall, I really like this. So for players, my recommendation: purchase this. I think it is a great system. I think they ironed out a lot of the problems that the Power Rangers core book had, and this just feels significantly more complete, and you're going to get a lot more for your money. There is one additional role in this compared to Power Rangers, and each role has 3 subclasses. So when you look at that, this has significantly more character options than what we've seen previously, and they feel good. I really like them. I'll go into more specifics when I actually talk about each one of the chapters, but for players, buy this. For GMs, GMs obviously have a different thing that they need to look at. Obviously, there needs to be enough of a system there for the players to create their characters and for the GM to understand those characters so that they can create interesting conflicts and situations for them to be put in. But you also need GM tools. The Essence system itself is really, really nice in the idea that running an Essence system game isn't remarkably complicated. You're not going to need to learn a bunch of rules like you would if you wanted to run something like Pathfinder or Shadowrun or anything like that. Even compared to D&D 5e, the Essence system is built a lot more around a storytelling aspect. Very similar to the cipher system, in where you kind of define scenes and then you go things, or looking at other things like the Avatar role-playing game, where you set a scene, you deal with the scene, and then you move to the next scene. And I like that kind of storytelling, that almost I guess narrative style storytelling that you would see in like a television show or in a movie, where you go scene to scene to scene, which is what G.I. Joe is. I mean, it was a cartoon that was created to sell toys, is what it was. So I like that. That means running the game really isn't super, super difficult, but there are certain things that you definitely need as a GM. And probably one of the most useful things that they have in here that they didn't really have a good selection of in the Power Rangers RPG is the threats section. This is effectively your monster manual, and it is good. There is significantly more creatures in this than there was in the Power Rangers game, and there are significantly different levels. Now, this is kind of because G.I. Joe is a different television show than Power Rangers. Power Rangers, you have your generic putties, and then every episode you have a big baddie monster that you have to fight. G.I. Joe isn't that way. In G.I. Joe, they go and they infiltrate a place, and they'll deal with a bunch of generic baddies that just kind of show up and go Cobra, and do stuff like that, and then they go Joe, and they do cool stuff. But it makes sense that there would be more varied enemies in this. But even taking that into account, the threats chapter, which is chapter 12 for this, is just better than the one that was introduced in Power Rangers. Again, when we go through that chapter, I'll go into more specifics, but there is enough here combining with chapter 11, which is locations, which is effectively, talks about the different places where the G.I. Joes might start. They have different plot points that you can start with. And then chapter 12, the threats, gives you really everything you need to start running adventures. And chapter 13 is called Running a Mission. And just like the last book, Running a Mission is also, they give you an introductory adventure, which is really nice. I like the introductory adventure here. It feels good. It is the perfect adventure for people that are starting a brand new G.I. Joe campaign, because the adventure itself is your first day in G.I. Joe, and it's well written. It looks like it's fun to run. I like it. The other thing that's nice is in the introduction, just like in Power Rangers, you have General Hawk's debriefing, which is basically their Zordon. But then you have what's called the G.I. Joe data files, which has 80 different named Joes. Now, each one only gets a couple paragraphs. Like, basically, they get a description of who they are, and then a paragraph giving them a little bit of flavor, and that's it. So this is not a really, really extravagant thing, but this gives you 80 different NPCs that you can use to introduce missions. You can use to give them hints and locations. Obviously, the Joes that you're going to be dealing with are going to be their own team, so they're not going to be teaming up with like Snake Eyes and things like that right from the get-go. Snake Eyes is a little bit too important for that. But it has so much there. Significantly more kind of world built into it than the other ones. Now, you are going to have to do a little bit of the heavy lifting yourself. There's still not, like the locations chapter is entirely locations where G.I. Joes are, not locations where they might go. And the first sample adventure that they put in there, you do spend the entire thing at one of the G.I. Joe bases, and there is some conflict and things that are there, spoiler alert, wow, I'm feeling really dumb right now. Cobra shows up, and you have to deal with him. Wow, I felt real dumb. So, yes, you can have these kind of things where they're just, in one of these bases, which are varied. And have everything take care there. But you are going to have to come up with some of your own locations and the things like that for them to do. But again, this is set in the real world. And G.I. Joe are international, so they can go anywhere. So personally, I think it's a little bit easier to kind of create your own adventures and things like that with G.I. Joe than it would be with the Power Rangers. Because the Power Rangers, while yes, they do technically take place on Earth, they take place in a weird version of Earth in a city that doesn't exist. So yeah, overall, my recommendation to Game Masters, pick up the book. I think this is a significantly better introduction to the Essence system than the Power Rangers book was. And you can run a complete campaign if you want out of this book. As you start getting to higher and higher levels, you're probably going to have to pull more and more out of your own bag of tricks. But there's enough here to get a really solid campaign. And by the time you would start getting to high level stuff, they will probably have released more stuff by then. So yes, GMs, this is a definite buy. For Lore Hounds, This is an interesting book. G.I. Joe, in and of itself, is not a super lore-filled game. Not a super lore-fulfilled property, to be perfectly honest. Now, I'm not saying that there is no lore or anything like that. There is. The cartoon itself was real popular in the 80s. They kept releasing toys and stuff like that to today. So it's not that like G.I. Joe hasn't existed or anything. But the show hasn't been on TV since the 80s. The movies were interesting, but they didn't really lean into the lore super well. I believe there's been some comics and other things like that for G.I. Joe, but for the most part, it just doesn't have as much lore as something like the Power Rangers or Transformers, which is the next book series that they're going to be releasing under Essence. And as far as in the book itself, Chapter 1, which is the introduction, is really the only place where you have a lot of lore. There are little bits of lore sprinkled in throughout the entire book. And Chapter 11, the locations, does have a decent amount of lore. But the chapter itself is barely over to the 10 pages. It's only 14 pages. And then... Again, they have 80 different Joes in there, but each one is like a couple lines that explain who they are, and then a short little paragraph that gives them a little bit of character, and that's it. So for someone that's really into the kind of the lore of G.I. Joe, you're probably going to find this wanting. This is an RPG core book that is designed to get people to play the RPG. This is not like a campaign setting style of a book where it's designed to kind of create a world that you can exist in. This is very much focused on players and GMs. So if you are interested in G.I. Joe lore and you're interested in kind of just the stories behind it, I would probably say the physical copy, which runs about $55, is probably not something that you want to buy unless you really want something physical to hold on to. The PDF will probably be more than fine, and even then, it's a bit of a hard sell for me, just because there's not a ton of lore here. If you're never going to play the game, you can probably pass this up and find better places to get lore than this. But if you're planning to play, if you're a lore hound and also a GM, or a lore hound and also a player, then yeah, this is a great book. So those are my purchase recommendations. Players, buy the book if you're interested in G.I. Joe specifically or the Essence system. This is a really good introduction to it. GMs, buy the book again if you're interested in G.I. Joe or the Essence system. This is a much better introduction than the Power Rangers one. If you are someone that purchased the Power Rangers one and you're still feeling a little bit let down from that, this is a really nice supplement for that. The classes or the roles are not really going to translate well. They're too different to be able to use interchangeably. You're not going to be able to take a commando, which is one of the roles, and turn it into a ranger. The systems don't work that well. But the threats do. The threats section effectively gives you a bunch more smaller monsters that you can use to make things a little bit more interesting for your rangers. And then there are some things that I'll talk about in the in-depth review. They do clarify things much better in this book than the previous one. So if there's certain things, like a good example was we got into a conversation in my comment section about the stun effect. The stun effect is given a significantly better explanation in this book, and I now understand it perfectly. Whereas in the Power Rangers book, it was really hard to understand and I didn't know what it was doing. So a lot of the criticisms I had of Power Rangers, they fixed in this, which I think is a good thing. So anyway, with that, I'm going to start my in-depth review. Now, when I say in-depth, I mean in-depth. I'm going to go through this chapter by chapter. I'm going to talk about the things I like, the things that I don't like, the things I think need work. I have seen that the writers and creators of this sometimes will watch this, so Some of this information is going to be me speaking directly to them, saying, hey, you need to fix this in your book. Some of the information is going to be me speaking specifically to dungeon masters, or me speaking specifically to players about what to do with the things. But this is very in-depth. This is going to be an hour long at least while I go through all of this. So if you're not in this for the long haul, thank you so much for showing up. Please like, subscribe, turn notifications on, and let me know in the comments what your favorite part about the possible aspects of the book are. That being said, let us start off. Really quickly, I have got to take off this because I think I've got a little bit too tight and I'm starting to lose circulation in my fingers. So I just wanted to say that before I made this really loud sound. I messed up my thumb recently, and so I've been wearing that to try and get my thumb to work a little bit better. So anyway, let's start with Chapter 1, the introduction. Again, it starts off with a thing called General Hawk's debriefing. General Hawk is the head of G.I. Joe, and this is kind of your in-lore introduction to G.I. Joe. It gives not only a kind of really brief overview of what G.I. Joe is, but it talks about the major bad guys you're going to be dealing with. There's a section on Cobra Commander, the Baroness, Destro, and a couple other people that I wasn't as familiar with. You know, they talk about Storm Shadow and Zartan and Zarana, but they also have Tomax and Zaymat Paoli and Dr. Mindbender, just to kind of give you a much larger rogues gallery than I originally thought. Like when I think of, you know, G.I. Joe, because again, G.I. Joe was before my time. It was real big in the 80s. When I started getting into the things like that in the 90s, Power Rangers is there, and that's what I focused on. So I never really got into G.I. Joe like some other kids did. I think I had a G.I. Joe at one point, but I think I made them into a Power Ranger anyway, because that's how I did things. So the Rogues Gallery's a little bit bigger than I thought, and it's a nice introduction. Again, I don't have the nostalgia for G.I. Joe, so it's possible that someone that is more nostalgic about this will really enjoy listening to or reading General Hawk's, you know, description of all this stuff. After that, you have the G.I. Joe data files. Like I said, they have like 80 different Joes in here. I'm going to just read a couple to give you an idea. They have Ace, Alpine, Ashiko, Big Lob, Blowtorch, Dial Tone, Doc, Flint, Duke, Jinx, Hit and Run, Iceberg, Mainframe, Mercer. Yes, there is a G.I. Joe named Mercer, and I find that hilarious. Lieutenant Falcon, Ripcord, Rock and Roll, Roadblock, Sharpshooter, Snake Eyes, Snowstorm, Taurus, Tiger, Tunnel Rats, and Wild Bill. This is how G.I. Joe worked. Everybody had their code name, and that's what their action figure would be, and each one had their own little weapon and things like that. And that is this entire section. It's just all these different Joes. Now, there's a specific section at the end that says, now you know. What about my favorite Joe? You will see these now you know sections all over. This is their little aside things. And they talk about... I'm going to just read the first paragraph out of this. There are a lot of G.I. Joes. Between the toys, cartoons, and comics, G.I. Joe has over 500 unique characters. For the G.I. Joe role-playing game, we narrowed the active roster down to a little more than 80. There's a lot of G.I. Joes. If you're a G.I. Joe fan, there's a good chance that your favorite Joe might not be listed here specifically. Doesn't mean they don't exist. They just... 500 characters. They had a limited amount of space here, and the ones that they put in here are some of the most popular ones. So, yeah, like... I don't know what to tell you. If your favorite one isn't in here, you can put them in here. It's not super difficult to do. But yeah, I found it interesting because again, I didn't realize it'd been over 500 unique characters in the GI Joe franchise. So, going forward in Chapter One, they have the GI Joe role playing game section, which is basically it's literally just a page where they say, "Hey, this is a role playing game. This is how role playing games work. It's super simple." And then the very next section is called character creation. Or that's chapter 2. So yeah, the last section of this is just the role playing game, and like I said, it's literally just a single page with a lot of art. It's technically 2 pages, but the text only takes up a single page. And yeah, it is just, hey, this is what a role playing game is, and that's it. Overall, the introduction is nice. I would have liked to see a little bit more lore built into this. I understand why they didn't, because again, they have 80 characters in here. So I understand why there isn't more kind of lore to the world itself. But the majority of the lore in the introduction, which this is almost all the lore in the entire book, is talking about Cobra, which I mean kind of makes sense. Like GI Joe is Cobra is anti GI Joe, and GI Joe is anti Cobra. Everything that you're going to be doing this is fighting against Cobra or one of the other groups that ally themselves with Cobra. So I guess it kind of makes sense, but you don't really get a ton about the GI Joes themselves. Maybe a little bit of history for them. Something like that would have been cool. But overall, it's a very, very nice introduction. It's a lot of stuff there. Like I said, there's just tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of characters that you can kind of bring in, especially if you have players that are fans of GI Joe, having them in there and get debriefed by Duke or Wetsuit or Starduster. It might be a big deal for them. So, moving on. Chapter 2, Character Creation. Now, almost every single RPG core book has a chapter like this. And some of them are decent. Some of them I feel are a huge misnomer. Because as much as it says this is character creation, this is a broad overview of what character creation involves. But this chapter will not help you create a character. This kind of just gives you a roadmap of which chapters you need to go to in order to build your character. Even things like, I mean, I guess it's a little bit better because, like, step 2, set starting essences. It does tell you that, okay, this is how many essence points you have, and you can put them in the things. So I guess this is a little bit more useful than some other ones. It's not that this is a bad chapter or anything like that, but this is a chapter that you're going to read once, and then you're never going to open this again, except maybe for looking at the starting essences to give a reminder of how many essences you start with. But otherwise, this literally is a one-time read. You never open this section of the book again. And I'm not a huge fan of that in general, especially since it's a decent-sized chapter to be just filler, effectively. Starts on page 33 and then goes all the way to 40. So, I mean, it's 7 pages that you're never going to read again. But yeah, it's simple. It outlines what you need to do. It does have the same issue that the Power Rangers role playing game had, where they don't introduce the essence system until the end of character creation. And I think that is a huge problem because none of this stuff makes any sense until you read the essence section that tells you, okay, this is how the essence system works. And it just seems like a really strange way to lay out the book. If anyone from Renegade is watching this, your chapter 6 essence scores and skills should be chapter 3. It should come before influences, before origins, and definitely before roles, because reading this book from start to finish, nothing makes sense until you get to chapter 6 and go, oh, that's what all this stuff means. And then you have to go back to chapters 3, 4, and 5 in order to build a character. You cannot start building a character until you go to chapter 6 and understand what any of this stuff means. So anyone from Renegade reading this, the next time you release a book, flip the chapters. Put essence, scores, and skills right after the character creation chapter. It will flow much better, and it will make much more sense for people to build characters out of. And that's all I really have to say about chapter 2. Moving on. Chapter 3. Influences. As I mentioned before, influences are your background, effectively. If you're a D&D 5e player, influences are backgrounds. The fact that they show influences before you choose your origin, which is effectively your race, or your role, which is your class, I think is good. And the reason behind that is in the D&D 5e Player's Handbook, backgrounds show up after your races, after your classes. They show up pretty far into the book. And because of that, most people ignore their background after they choose it at level 1. Once you choose your background at level 1 in D&D, no one ever uses it. I have an entire series on my D&D deep dives where I went through backgrounds and how to use them further on in the game. Having you choose your influence right at the beginning, before you choose your origin, before you choose your role, put some weight in the idea that your influence is something that's important. Just like the Power Rangers role-playing game, you can actually choose multiple influences. Each influence will have a perk and a hang-up. So having multiple influences will give you multiple perks, but it'll also give you multiple hang-ups. I believe they give the recommendation that you generally don't want to choose more than 2. Just because it may be something that I'm just picking out of here. But all the examples that they give are just 2 influences. And that's probably where you want to stop. But you can build a character with just a single influence, or you can build characters with multiple influences, and neither one is going to feel more or less powerful. You're just going to have different choices that you can make, and I like that. It's one of my favorite things about the Essence system is the influences feel really important compared to the backgrounds, which are important in D&D, but aren't that important, and you have to kind of really try in order to turn them into something interesting. You don't with the influences in the Essence system. They're just really nice. I like the influences in here. I think they're a little bit better than the Power Rangers one, just because Power Rangers ones mostly just kind of fit into those kind of John Hughes high school archetypes that don't actually exist. These are really interesting the things, like you could be an athlete, or you could have a checkered past, or they have a martial artist one. You could have one that's small town roots as an influence that I thought was kind of interesting, or a thrill seeker. You know, there's a bunch of different things that really allow you to create an interesting, unique character that existed before they became a Joe. And that's something that a lot of players have a hard time dealing with in D&D that I've seen, is your character had an entire life before becoming an adventurer. Being an adventurer is the second part of your life, and you had an entire history beforehand. And the influence system really gives you a nice explanation and a nice way to kind of show that, yes, my character existed before joining the Joes, and that existence has changed my character completely to where I'm going to be a different Joe than this other person because of the influences that happened in my life before getting here. So I like that. I think it's cool. Moving on to Chapter 4, Origins. The reason I call Origins your race in this effectively is they do actually change your essence scores. They give you ability score improvements. And the Origins are pretty simple for the most part. You have Origins for each branch of the military. I'm going to change that. They have origins they have an Army origin, they have a Navy origin, and they have an Air Force origin. They do not have a Marine or Coast Guard. And I understand that the Marines are technically part of the Navy, but you go ahead and tell a Marine that they're part of the Navy and watch what happens there. So they don't have a Marine or Coast Guard thing origin. But the Navy specifically does have Marines listed under the other origins in there. So, yeah. In addition to that, they have a non-branch specific origin, so things like first responders, covert ops, intelligence. And that's something I really, really like about this is the idea that a lot of people think G.I. Joe, oh, they're all military, well, technically. But when you look at the characters of G.I. Joe, not everyone in G.I. Joe is former military. Not all of them are going in with a big old gun and shooting up the place. You had a lot of really interesting characters. So if you had a covert ops or an intelligence, first of all, covert ops, being a spy, is an interesting background into getting into this kind of paramilitary organization. I'm a huge fan of Burn Notice, the television series. It was one of my favorite shows. I've watched every episode multiple times. So having a covert ops origin, I think would be really cool. Intelligence is another completely interesting field. There was, what was it called? Was it Covert Affairs was another TV show that I really, really love. Piper Perabo is in it. It's amazing. That shows, people that work for the CIA actually in country or other intelligence organizations. Where you're not a spy, you're an intelligence officer. And it's a completely different skill set. And I like the fact that you could be covert ops or into intelligence and then get into G.I. Joes and be a very, very different G.I. Joe. I mentioned before in the Power Rangers one, I'll mention it here. Your origin is so much more useful than your race in D&D. Again, in D&D, you are mostly defined by your class. In the Essence system, your influence and your origin are going to define you as much, if not more, than your role. And I love that. In addition to all the kind of government stuff, they also have non-military stuff. You have civilians, you have engineers, scientists, if you want to be that. So, yeah, overall, the origin section, I really, really like it. I think I like it a little bit more than even the Power Rangers one. I liked the Power Rangers one. So, yeah, overall, I think it's really, really good, great. Moving on. Chapter 5, Roles. These are your classes. The classes are interesting. To be blunt, they're just interesting. There's a lot of a variety. And like I said, one of the things I like, I found that I'm starting to like more and more and more, is more generic RPG features. And what I mean by that is, one of the systems that I run regularly is the Open Legend system. And it is a generic system, and it's a skill-based system. And because of that, it means that I actually have two players that use the same skill. They use an entropy, is one of the skills you can have, which basically allows you to kind of manipulate death energy, kind of. But they use it massively differently. One of them literally drains the life out of people. The other one controls shadows and, coalesces them into, bladed weapons and the things like that. So, I like the idea that they just call it entropy and you're allowed to add your own flavor. The roles in here have a lot of that generic aspect to it, where they will give you a mechanical benefit and they will give you a title, but they go, you know what, go to town with this, flavor it however you want. The actual roles that they have are Commando, Infantry Officer, Ranger, Renegade, Technician, and Vanguard, and they all do something a little bit different. Commandos are going to be very much your rogue style characters. However, and this is the thing that I love so much, one of their kind of defining features, if you want to call it, one of their special aspects is sneak attack. They get sneak attack. It works almost identically to how sneak attack works in 5th edition. Again, the Power Rangers role-playing game, which is the first one of the Essence System Giga games, was originally a 5th edition supplement. So they're always going to have a little bit of influence in all of the Essence systems. And that's what this is. This is your rogue. However, your focus for this, you have Infiltrator, Sniper, and Spy. And that is my favorite part about this, is your rogue role. Your Infiltrator is going to be much closer to what you would generally think of a rogue. Sniper is going to be your shooty rogue. Spy gets much closer to a bard in the idea that it is much more about social abilities and manipulation and the things like that. And yet it's still going to be as useful on the battlefield as the Infiltrator, as this is a Sniper. And I love it. I think it's really, really interesting. In the Power Rangers RPG, you had like 3 different versions of feats. In this, you have general perks. That's it. Those are your feats. You get them at 4th, 8th, 12th, 16th, and 19th levels. So identical to ability score improvements in D&D. That's all they have, and I think it works better. Your focus is going to allow you to customize it a little bit. Your general perks will allow for the rest of your customizability. There is no multi-classing as far as I can tell, and to be blunt, I don't really see a huge need for it, because the entire point of G.I. Joe is everybody is a specialist in something. The reason you get put together in your team to do things is everyone has a different thing that they're good at, compared to RPGs where you're basically just kind of talking about the abilities of your character as a whole. This is your role, is your job. These are specific skills that you bring to specific missions, and outside the mission you're not really using those things. There's other ways to exist outside of G.I. Joe. So yeah, I like this stuff. Going to infantry. Infantry is your fighter, effectively. They get fighting styles. They get extra attack. They get more attacks. They get 3 attacks at 11th level, 4 attacks at 20th level. Like, this is your fighter. And the focuses are interesting. One of the focuses for the infantry is medic, which I love. Again, that's the thing I love about these focuses, or these foci, they do really, really change how the character is played, and you wouldn't really think of a fighter being the healer, but the infantry, you could have an infantry medic, and they can fill that role really, really well. And I love that. I think it's super, super cool. Moving on, you have the officer, which I'm a little bit in love with the officer, because the officer, I've talked about this before, the officer is the warlord. One of their starting role perks is called Battle Commander. They are the person that issues orders. They are the commander. They're the field commander, and I love that kind of role. They have 3 different foci. Your battlefield, and this is another one that I think is really cool. You have officer. You think of like, oh, and that's another thing that they did do with this is at the beginning of each role they will give GI Joe examples. So for officers, the examples that they give, General Hawk, Duke, Admiral Keelhaul are the 3 that most people will think of. But they also have Psych Out. And in the examples, they tell which focus that character would have. Psych Out is a battlefield psychologist. And I love the fact that one of the foci for this class, this warlord style class, is a psychologist. Not a psionicist, not anything like that. It's just psychology. Then you have frontline leader, and you have grandmaster. Like they're just really, really cool and interesting. Ranger is exactly what you think. The Ranger is what I wish the 5th edition Ranger was. You get a specific environmental expertise, which I love, and it actually works significantly better than anything that the 5th edition Ranger has done. It upsets me. This is such a good version of a Ranger that it upsets me because I can't use this in D&D 5th edition because the systems aren't that close. But it shows you what a Ranger could be and all the cool things that you could do with it, and I just love it. They also get a limited resource that allows you to do some interesting things called adaptation, which is based on their environmental expertise. Like the whole thing is just really, really cool. And for their foci, they have 3 different foci, obviously. One of them is Beastmaster. It's a pet ranger. And pets are a big part of this. There's a lot of different, there's actually quite a few different classes that have pets, and there's a feat that can give you a different kind of pet called a drone. Pets are a big thing in here, and I like how they work, too. And then you have Predator, which is just, this is the description they have for Predator. Predator, a human hunter. It's all they say about it, and it fits. And then Scout's the last one, and again, everything about this feels so much better than the 5th edition Rubber Ranger, and I love it. I think it's really, really cool. I get excited thinking about what kind of character I want to create with the Ranger. Renegade. Renegade's a barbarian, to be blunt. It's interesting. It's just crazy. The 3 foci, your blitzer is going to be people that go up with melee weapons. You have door kicker and tank. And it just, again, instead of rage, you have reckless abandon. But this is your barbarian, and it's a cool barbarian style character. Technician are going to be kind of your closest to I guess kind of your caster class. They're not really spellcasters or anything like that, but they're interesting, just to say the least. The focus is expert, think tank, and tinkerer, and I don't want to give too much away about this, but I would say the technician is probably one of the more unique classes in here that you're not going to see in D&D. Like there isn't really an equivalent class in D&D. This is a uniquely G.I. Joe thing, and I think it's really cool. Finally, we get the Vanguard. The Vanguard is such an interesting character because it is the Vanguard is your tank class. You might consider them like a paladin kind of the thing, but their specific kind of interesting thing they have is they have a personal shield, which just ups their defenses by a significant amount. One thing they don't mention here is they talk about you throw the personal shield on the ground, but they don't talk about whether or not you have to stay in the personal shield or if the personal shield moves with you or anything like that. That would be one thing I would want clarified. And I haven't read the class close enough. Like, I've read through the entire class, but I really have to sit down with it to figure out if it would be game breaking to have them be able to move with their personal shield or not. Because they have limited uses of it. But it's just this interesting thing that they can put on. They have all these things that allow them to kind of protect their allies, their foci. They have a bodyguard, they have a heavy ordnance, and juggernaut, and each one kind of fills that tank role in very, very different ways. And it's a cool class. Like I said, I liken it to the Paladin specifically because of their auras, and the personal shield are kind of similar. But this is such a different class that you can't... This is another one that's kind of unique to G.I. Joe. And I think it's really cool, really interesting. And yeah, everything about it is just fun. To give an example, for the heavy ordnance focus, one of their abilities is called... It's what it's called. How can you not love a class that has a class feature called... Like, it's just cool. It's just cool. So yeah, that is chapter 5. Like I said, overall, these classes feel so much better than the roles, or these roles feel so much better than the roles in Power Rangers. They feel distinct. They feel customizable because of the different foci. And the general perks that you can take will allow you to customize them even more. So this just feels like a significantly more complete system than the Power Rangers system felt at first. The other thing that's nice about this, after reading this and getting a much better understanding of how the Essence systems work, I can now work backwards with the roles in Power Rangers, and I feel like I understand them significantly better, to the point where I understand what they're trying to go with Power Rangers. This probably would have... I probably would have reviewed the Power Rangers book better if I'd read the G.I. Joe book first, because this feels like a much more complete introduction to the system. And the Power Rangers version of it, they take away the subclasses and they give you a much larger amount of customizability, and because of that, it feels like it's less is there. Reading this, I'm starting to understand that it isn't that there's less there. They're allowing you to be a little bit more customized, a little bit more freeform. Again, it feels like a kind of merging of a class-based and a skill-based RPG into one. And if I'd read this book first, I would have understood that much, much better. So yeah, overall, Chapter 5 is really, really well done. I'm super happy about it. Yeah. Moving on. Chapter 6. Essence Scores and Skills. This is pretty darn identical to what was in the Power Rangers. They flesh out a few things a little bit better. One of my biggest issues with the system before, and I think it's in here. I have to look. Before I say the wrong thing, I'm gonna... Is it not in here? Oh, it is. Okay, so I guess I'll get to that in just a second. So we'll start off with this section. It starts off kind of explaining how the Essence system works. Like I said, this should have been Chapter 3, not Chapter 6. Because this first part is essential in understanding how everything works. And then the next part is they give each one of the essences. You have strength, you have speed, you have smarts, and you have social. And then it shows all the different skills and some sample specializations within each of those skills. Understanding this makes everything before actually make sense. Without this, it just doesn't make sense. And so this is really, really, really useful. The next part, after they describe each one of the 4 essences, they have the using skills, and they have table 6-1, the dice shift ladder. I talked about this before because in the Power Rangers role-playing game, basically what it is it shows the different dice, and you have these things called shifting. Shifting is basically you have your base roll, but then depending on things that are happening in the game, you will also roll. You might also change how things are working. Like if you have some sort of, it's basically what replaces the advantage disadvantage system. Something's going good, you might shift up. So normally, let's say normally you would roll this skill test with a d20 and a d8. Your d8 is your skill die. But this is an attack and you have high ground. Well, we're going to shift you up once. And what that means, instead of rolling a d8, you're going to roll a d10. And there's multiple shifts that you can have, and multiple snags are what happens when you go lower. The base die, you have a d2, which is the coin flip, d4, d6, d8, d10, d12, are the only ones that you can have as part of your basic roll. However, going if you have a d12 and you shift up, it goes into special things. You get 2d8 or 3d6, and if you shift up enough, you can get auto success and auto crits. However, below d20 in the Power Rangers book, it just said base die on the chart. But when you looked on the actual explanation of what everything meant, there was no base die anywhere. They had single d20, and it annoyed the hell out of me because it just is bad design. It's someone didn't edit it correctly, and they had a specific thing that was never explained anywhere in the book. Now, using basic process of elimination, you could figure out that, base die and single d20 have to mean this is the same thing, but it's sloppy, and it causes confusion really, really quickly, and it will cause ruse lawyers to argue. This, they got rid of base die, they call it single d20. I like that. It's much better. It's how it should have been the Power Rangers one. Oops. Like I said, I believe it was just an editing error that they made, and they fixed it on this one, which I like. And that's what it is. Shifting is any movement. You have an edge, which is a shift up, and you have a snag, which is a shift down. And it works pretty well. I'm a huge, huge fan of the advantage-disadvantage system because of how simple it is when you want to run something. If someone comes up with a really interesting idea, you don't have to go, okay, is that worth a +2 or +3 or blah, 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 blah. No, you just go, okay, that's a good idea, advantage. Or, you know what, that sounds difficult. We're going to call it disadvantage. And that's all it takes. With the shift system, it is slightly more complicated, but just slightly so. You can have multiple shifts up or snags and things like that. You know, snags are edges up and snags down, and edges and snags can cancel each other out. But it's not super complicated. It's not the floating modifier issue that like 3rd edition and Pathfinder has, where you just have 17 billion numbers that just magically appear during an attack roll. So I like that it's slightly more complicated than the advantage-disadvantage system, but it's not massively complicated. And all you really need to be able to understand it is that little table that shows up on page 123. If you want to look it up, it shows up in one other place as well, but it's pretty simple to be able to understand. So I like that. And then there's a section called story points. Story points is another aspect of the essence system. It's something that I really, really like. Story points, effectively, you have a pool of story points for the GM, and you have a pool of story points for the players. And whenever certain things happen, the players will get more story points. Or when certain things happen for the GM, they will get story points as well. And you can use these story points um, to do things. You can use them to make rerolls. You can use them to add defenses add to defenses, so you're harder to hit. Things like that. They're a useful tool that can be used to reward players and to add little modifications to combat on the fly without having to have a huge list of rules. This and the shifting system kind of replace the idea of advantage at a disadvantage. This gives you all the real tools that you're going to need to deal with those players that are incredibly creative. When they're coming up with interesting things, you go, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a story point for that because that's an interesting solution to this. Or you know what? I'm going to give you an edge of 2 for that. Or you know what? I'm going to give you a snag for that because that's going to make this more difficult. But it was really interesting, so I'm going to give you a story point. Or you know what? Because you guys failed this, I'm going to put a story point in the GM's pool. So there's a lot of different things that you can do, and I think it's really interesting and fun. So yes, that is chapter 6. Chapter 7. General perks. These are your feats. And there's enough of them here that you can make some really interesting things. I mentioned before, the Ranger is a specific class that gets a pet. There's also an animal pet. There is an animal pet general perk that you can take, and it actually is a prerequisite of you have to have at least a D4 in your animal handling, which I like. It means that you need to invest in the skills to use your pet before you can take a feat effectively that allows you to have a companion, basically. We'll talk about how to run these a little bit later because they do explain how all this stuff works. But again, adding pets to an RPG can unbalance the game really, really quickly. In D&D 5th edition, because of how important action economy is, adding any additional characters to combat complicates things massively. And so balancing pets is a huge, huge issue. The way that they do it in the Essence system, I think, is actually really interesting. You actually use an action to command your pet. You actually have a roll that you have to make in order to command them to do anything. But once you give them that command and you use your standard action to do that, they will continue doing that until they complete whatever it was that you told them to do. And it's going to be up to the GM to kind of define exactly how complicated or vague you can get with your commands. But you're basically going to be sacrificing a single turn to get your pet to do something, and then you're going to be able to fight alongside them. And so I like that. I think it's interesting. As far as the other general perks, there's a lot, and they allow you to do a lot of different things. Like I'm not going to get into all of them, but they're one of the things I like about them is a lot of them have prereqs built into skills. So like people person requires deception or persuasion of at least a D6. So you have to have invested in that particular skill enough times before you can take this perk. And I like that. Because you don't get a ton of them, they feel very much like 5th edition feats. They do pretty significantly change how you play your character. And because a lot of them have prereqs and things like that, I'm not really seeing a whole lot here that are going to effectively cause issues where combining different feats can create unintended consequences. All of these are unique enough and give you enough things to do with them that they're never going to feel wasted. Because your essence improvements are not an either or thing like they are in 5th edition, where you either get ability score improvement or a feat. This, you always are going to get a feat, and your ability score improvements, your essence improvements, are contained in a different section of the chart. So yeah, you're going to be able to use them, and yeah, I mean, there's cool stuff in here. I'd like to see a few more. There's only one, two, three, four, five. There's only 6 pages of them. So when you compare to something like the number of feats that are available just in the player's handbook, this is a significantly more limited list. But this is something that will probably be expanded pretty quickly. As soon as they start releasing supplements for this, there's going to be tons more feats. And, you know, cooking up your own feats in 5th edition is not difficult. Cooking up your own general perks in this is probably not going to be super difficult either. So there's a lot here that you can homebrew. There's enough here that I don't think it needs any homebrewing. But after you've played a couple campaigns, or after you've built a couple different characters in G.I. Joe, you're probably going to start feeling a little bit limited with the feats that are here. But by that point, they will have released more. So, yeah. Moving on. Chapter 8. Equipment. In the Power Rangers role-playing game, the equipment section was probably the most confusing. Because Power Rangers don't technically get a lot of equipment. Generally, your Power Ranger is going to have their Blade Blaster thing. Every Power Ranger has something equivalent to a Blade Blaster. It's generally going to be a gun and a sword combined, or they'll have a gun and a sword, but it's their generic thing that all of them have. And then they have their power weapon, which is unique to the character. So, in all, generally, for Power Rangers, you only ever deal with 2 pieces of equipment through your entire Power Ranger career. Sometimes they will get something like the V-Lancers in Lightspeed Rescue, or like the SWAT upgrade for SPD. They might get something different, but generally, you don't really get a lot of different weapons. For G.I. Joe, there are a lot of weapons. You know, they're going to get a ton of different things, and so the equipment here just makes more sense because you're going to be using a lot more equipment as G.I. Joe than you would be as a Power Ranger. The system is identical to the one like this is the Essence equipment system, and it's the exact same thing. You have different rarities. You have standard, limited, and then restricted weapons, and depending on your level, you can have access to different kind of weapons. There is an upgrade. Well, they have weapon effects and traits, and this is where, like, I'm going to use stun as an example. They have different types of traits, and each one does something different. But before, they were really, really confusing as far as how they worked. And specifically, the stun one was the most confusing. Now, stun has a very similar description as it did in Power Rangers, but they actually have an example section that makes this significantly easier to understand. So I'm actually going to explain the stun system specifically just to give an idea of how these different effects and traits work. So stun, successfully hitting with a stun weapon means the target is denied a move action for the listed number of turns. Stun effects stack. That little sentence there did not exist in the Power Rangers, and it is a super important aspect, or it might have. I'm actually not 100% certain. Let's go here. There we go. Stun. Yeah, it didn't. So it specifically says stun effects stack, which is nice. Creatures hear 1 stun at the end of their turn. If a creature suffers an amount of stun, a total stun equal to the amount of health the creature has left, they fall unconscious, defeated. For example, Mercer, Red Dog, and Taurus attack a Motor Viper with bare-handed brawling and close combat bludgeoning, all of which deal stun 1. Everyone hits, dealing a total of stun 3. Motor Viper loses his move action for the next 3 turns. Had one of the Joes scored a critical hit and brought the total up to stun 4, the Motor Viper would be defeated because his stun total equals his total health of 4. Likewise, if on the next turn the Joes deal 2 damage to him, the Motor Viper, who is now at stun 2 and health 2, would be defeated. So it actually explains for unarmed attacks. Unarmed combat is something, the effect of unarmed is one stun, but it has an alternate effect where it says 1 blunt damage, and it says snag 1. And you can maneuver, which is another thing you can do, which is snag 1. Which means if you use unarmed combat, you can either do 1 stun, or you can do 1 blunt damage. Stun just racks up the stun. It doesn't do any actual damage, whereas blunt damage lowers their total health. And that was something that was not explained in the other book, and it became very, very confusing. This one, it's explained really, really well, really, really simple, and now I understand how it works. And that one section was enough for me to understand the entirety of the weapons chart, because now I understand exactly how all this stuff works. Ow, something just got in my eye. All this stuff works, how to read the chart just from that little explanation of this is how stun works, and giving an example of an item that only has a stun effect. So yes, much better. I'm super excited that is in there. There's a weapon upgrade system. Again, it works just like the Power Rangers one. I like the upgrade system. You have rolls that you have to make if you want to upgrade. You have requisition things. Like there's an entire system about how you can get the equipment that you want. It's a well-designed system. I'm not going to go into all of it right now, but again, this feels so much more complete, despite the fact that it's remarkably similar to what was in the Power Rangers one. It just makes more sense. It's better explained here. The upgrade system was good in both. But the thing that is significantly better here is Battle Dress. Battle Dress is your armor. And in Power Rangers, Battle Dress made no sense, because Power Rangers don't wear different armor. They're all in spandex with helmets. It didn't make sense to have these different armor types and stuff like the Yellow Ranger and the Pink Ranger have the exact same uniform. The Blue Ranger, the Black Ranger, and the Red Ranger have the exact same uniform. The only difference is the color of the spandex. And the only difference between, well, actually, technically, the Pink Ranger has her own in Mighty Morphin, because she was the only female ranger in Sentai. Whereas in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, they were Trini, the Yellow Ranger, was also female. But because they were using the Sentai footage, the Yellow Ranger didn't have a skirt. So that's the only difference in any of the Power Rangers uniforms, is the female ones have skirts and the male ones do not. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense for them to have armor. And it felt like something that was taken from 5th edition that just kind of stayed over, and it shouldn't have. I'm still not a huge fan of the armor system in Power Rangers. I don't think it adds anything to it. I think you could take it out and you would still have a completely fine system. Just change a couple numbers in the roles section, you'd be fine. The battle dress system for G.I. Joe makes a hell of a lot more sense. First of all, there are more armors here. In Power Rangers, there was literally, I think there was a grand total of like 4 or 5 different types of armor, and that was it. And none of it made any sense. This does. You have automatic, which is your clothes. You have standard armor, which can be tactical armor, ballistic armor, or hard body armor. And one of those is light armor, one of them is medium armor, one of those is heavy armor. For limited, you have 1 light armor, 1 medium armor, 1 heavy armor, and 2 super heavy armors. And then for restricted, you have 1 medium armor, 1 heavy armor, and 2 super heavy armors. This makes so much more sense, and it fits more in the idea of G.I. Joe. When you look at the different G.I. Joes, some of them go in just wearing fatigues. And some of them go in with a whole kit, a whole suit that does all these different things, and different missions might have them wearing different things. And as they level up, they might start adding things to their kits. So, yeah, I significantly prefer the battle dress system compared to the Power Rangers armor system. That just didn't make any sense. Battle dress can be upgraded the same way. Again, the upgrade system in the Essence system is just well designed. I like it. It's something that the One Ring RPG had something kind of similar to that, to where instead of finding a new weapon, you could effectively upgrade your weapon in different ways. And the same thing is true about your armor. And I actually tend to prefer that over finding magic weapons. I understand in like D&D and a lot of other systems that is a part of the system, and it can be really cool to find like a named sword or something like that. But I do like the idea of effectively naming your own sword. Or in this, naming your own armor and adding modifications and things like that. This is where you really, really start to get the customization that isn't going to happen with your role or your perks or anything like that. Like, you can still create some pretty interesting characters just by using the upgrade system. And this is going to give a lot of replayability to it, because you could play the exact same role, the exact same focus, but use different armor and different weapons and upgrade them differently and feel very, very different with the flavor and the things like that you can add to it. So really, really like that. I think it's super cool. Final section is kits. Kits are basically ways that you can get a bonus to certain skill checks. And again, this is a system that I don't think would work super, super well in Power Rangers, but it makes perfect sense in G.I. Joe. If you're going into like an infiltration mission, you might get something like a limited burglary kit to help you get past things like that. Some of them are consumable. Some of them are just, things that give you benefits, like a climbing kit or something like that. But they're things that would be kind of mission specific that would help you out, that would make sense for a paramilitary organization to give you, because that's going to be part of your thing. They do require you to have some sort of skill in the, or some sort of training in the skill that they're going to improve in order to use them. Like, having a limited burglary kit doesn't mean that everyone can, pick a lock. You still have to have a D6 in infiltration in order to do it. But yeah, and they only give examples of 3 kits. So this is something that is designed to be very much kind of created on the fly. And they give you everything you need to know to be able to create something on the fly for the players. So the players go, you know what, since you're going to be doing this, can I have something that gives me this? Like, you know what, since we're going to be... since this is going to be an amphibious thing, can I have a kit that helps me swim? Or you know what, since this is going to be in a jungle, can I have a kit that will help me purify water or identify plants or something like that will be helpful to us? Like, there's a lot of different ways that you can use these kits that will make sense, and I think it really adds a lot and allows you to very, very give your teams very widely varied assignments and things like that, which really fits into the idea of how G.I. Joe works. I mean, every week they're doing something completely different, and they'll choose their specialist based on what's going on, but sometimes you're just going to have the people that are available, and they'll need a little bit of extra help. So yeah, overall, love it. I think it's super, super cool. Finally, they have things that are gear. Gear is effectively... to give an example, cell phones are gears, Geiger counters are gears, bolt cutters, jammers, data taps. They're just items that are going to be useful. They specifically said, like, a kit is a collection of items needed for a specific thing. Gear is like a single item. And yeah, that's what it is. It again, it makes sense. It's cool. It's interesting. The final part of this section, I believe it's the final part, is the pets section. And this talks about how you deal with a pet. And like I said, I think this works really well. I'll read a little bit of it just to kind of give an example of how it works. Commanding an animal pet requires a handle animal skill test as a standard action against a difficulty set by the availability of the animal. 0 for standard animal pet, 10 for a limited animal pet, 15 for a restricted animal pet. As you get more complex pets, as you kind of upgrade your pet, they become more difficult to command effectively because you're telling them to do more difficult things. Designate a skill. When you successfully command a pet, designate a skill you want it to use and a target for the skill, if applicable. The pet performs the command to the best of its ability until it believes it completed the command. You issue it another command, or you call it off as a free action. Your pet moves as it needs in order to complete your command. So, skills, attacks are you using skills. So in combat, you would command it to use a skill, which would be an attack against a specific enemy. And until that enemy is gone, the pet is going to continue attacking that enemy. So that may mean that you're trading your action every so often for your pet to tell your pet to do something else, or sometimes it may be just a better idea for you to not use your pet at all and just use your action for your own things. But I think it's a good way to deal with the fact that you are effectively controlling two characters. In addition to that, they have an entire thing defining your pet, and there are specific perks for your pet when you increase its essence abilities, which there's a whole system for that. It gets these perks. Your pet is literally a mini character that you get to use, and I think that's really interesting and really fun. There's also drone pets. I mentioned that before. You can get a drone. I think one of the roles, one of the focuses or foci, has a drone, and yeah, it's the same basic thing. Drones are going to act differently than animal pets, as they should. Drones specifically, instead of getting perks, they get upgrades, and they have an upgrade system very similar. Like, it's the same system used for weapons and weapons and armor, and it works. I like the idea that your drone is going to act differently than your animal pet, and you actually upgrade your drone, whereas your pet, you give them perks, basically training them. I love that. I think it's super cool. And then, sorry, not the final. The final section, I believe now, is vehicles. And vehicles kind of fill the same role as Zords. Vehicles were a big part of G.I. Joe because they sold more toys. However, vehicles don't feel nearly as essential as the Zords did for Power Rangers. And I think that's a benefit. There'll be missions that you send them on where they're going to be very vehicle heavy. There will be missions that you send them on that they're not going to get in their vehicles at all. And I like that. Again, as much as I love the Power Rangers and I know the Zords are a big thing, it did add a little bit of complication to it, in the idea that, well, the Zords are going to be showing up so often, and that you had your own personal Zord and it had to keep upgrading. Like, that got really confusing. These vehicles, again, because they're more limited, this is a much better introduction to vehicular combat than the Zords were. Again, if you start with G.I. Joe and then go to Power Rangers makes a hell of a lot more sense. But yeah, they're vehicles. They're cool, don't get me wrong. I don't think there's anything bad about them. They're vehicles. They're exactly what they sound like. They have different weapons and they all have different crew, and like, it's a vehicle. It's cool. I like it. I think it's great. Moving on. Chapter 9. Combat. This is the section that you will probably read the most as a GM, just because it explains how everything works. And for the most part, it makes sense. This is the same. This is the same thing that you had in the Power Range system. This is the Essence system, combat system, and it works pretty well. Again, my biggest issue with the Essence system is the words free action. Free action is a misnomer. It should be minor action. It should be lesser action. It should be, quick action. Anything other than free action, because free actions are not free. The way that actions work in the Essence system is based on your speed essence. If you have a speed of 1 on your turn, you can either move or perform a standard action. You don't get to do both. If you have a speed of 2, you can move and you can do a standard action. If you have a speed of 3 or more, you can do a move, a standard action, and a number of free actions equal to your speed minus 2. So basically at speed 3, you can do a move action, a standard action, and 1 free action. At speed 4, you get 2 free actions, speed 5, 3 free actions, etc., etc. Calling it a free action isn't true. It's not a free action. You have a limited number of them you can use, and not everybody gets free actions. I hate the term free action. It is such a bad term for this, especially since free actions exist in other RPGs, and they are literally that. They are free. They no action required. They don't count against your other actions. Calling this a free action is such a bad name. Please, 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 if you make revised versions of the Essence system, take out the word free action. Call it a quick action, call it a minor action, call it a step action, whatever you want to. Do not call it a free action. This is the most confusing part of the game. And it was really, really confusing, especially since free actions are not explained until the combat chapter, chapter 9. So when you're looking at your role and it's talking about the free actions you can take, I thought free action meant that I would be able to do this for free. And when I started seeing all these different free actions that were available to me in my role, I'm like, wow, I can do a lot of things. No, free actions aren't free. I will say that every single time I review an Essence system game, because this is such a bad thing. It's going to confuse players. Rules lawyers are going to argue about it constantly. It's going to confuse new GMs. It's going to confuse seasoned GMs. Change the name of free actions. It's a bad name. That being said, the rest of the system I like. Hit points are not massive. Most attacks do 1 point of damage. Eventually you start getting to 2 points into the 3 points, but your hit points are generally measured in single digits. They sometimes get up to double digits. So I like the fact that you don't have a bunch of different, when you get to something like D&D, where you can have 100 hit points and this attack does 50 hit points of damage and this one does 13. It adds a lot of math. This kind of simplifies things. And yeah, I like that. I didn't used to. When I played 4th edition, I liked the big numbers. I didn't like the fact that 5th edition made the numbers much smaller. Now that I've been playing a lot of different RPGs, I'm not as big a fan of big numbers. Big numbers just means math is a little bit more difficult. So I'm a big fan of small numbers. They list the different actions that you can take, which again makes perfect sense. They have an entire section on how to make an attack and multi-target attacks and ranged attacks. Here's where the other dice shift board is on page 201. It's the same basic thing that you saw back in chapter 6, I think it was. It's the exact same thing, and it's very, very useful. They have size class combat adjustments, literally just like the Power Rangers role-playing game. The big difference here is going to be you're probably not going to be fighting giant monsters in G.I. Joe anywhere near as much as you're going to be fighting them in Power Rangers. Yeah, other than that, it's pretty easy. Like, they talk about situation modifiers as skill shift up, skill shift down. Really simple stuff like that. They do talk about resistance and things like that. They talk about essence damage, which is basically your ability scores. Your essence goes down, which can be really, really damaging if your essence gets it doesn't do anything to your character until your essence score gets to 0. But once your essence score gets to 0, things get bad. Strength of 0 means you're comatose. Speed of 0, you're paralyzed. Smart of 0, you're caught in a stupor. And social of 0, yeah, they all do different things. But yeah, it's interesting. So this is another thing that I like about the essence system is you can add. Effectively, it works kind of like the exhaust system in 5th edition, where exhaust can add an additional kind of really, really bad effect to an attack. If an attack also adds levels of exhaustion, that's really, really big. Essence damage is not quite as damning as levels of exhaustion are, but it's the same kind of thing. Or lethal damage in Open Legend, kind of the same thing. That's an extra powerful thing, which again gives you more cool things that you can do to challenge the players. And then they have other things like underwater combat, mounted combat, vehicular combat, aerospace combat, stuff like that. So yeah, that is chapter 9. Chapter 10, Exploration. This one is not nearly as fleshed out as it is, even in like D&D 5th edition, where one of the entire pillars of 5th edition is exploration. And it's not explained super well in the player's handbook, but they do have a little bit of a section on it. The DMG expands on it significantly more. Here, it really just talks about movement for the most part. And then, some things like extreme cold, hostile weather, the things like that. And then conditions and things that you might find that. It's not an incredibly expansive thing, and it's obviously not. This is kind of a secondary aspect to, well, what happens in between missions? They do have a between missions and downtime section. What happens when we're not fighting? Well, that's what this chapter is. And it's, again, other than like the conditions section, you're probably not going to use this section a whole lot, because that's not what G.I. Joe is. G.I. Joe is the action section. So yeah, it's a good section. I would like a supplement that's more focused on exploration to really benefit characters like Rangers, to where they can feel a little bit more, and to kind of vary the amount of mission types you can send them on. Like, yes, stopping Cobra from attacking the rainforest is an important thing. But sending out G.I. Joes to build a forward base in a jungle could be something that's really cool, and you'll never deal with Cobra at all. But having an explore a more filled out exploration thing would allow you to do some non-Cobra involved things. I think it might be cool. Again, I don't think it fits 100% within the idea of what G.I. Joe was, but I think if G.I. Joe were really to exist, they would have G.I. Joe teams that their entire purpose is to go out and build forward command bases, or to scout areas that haven't been scouted before they send in a combat team. So that's what I would think would be in the section that doesn't exist. So, yeah, overall, simple section. Moving on. Chapter 11. Locations. This is a bunch of different locations, and they don't have a map, but and that's something that really irks me. But they don't really need maps for this because each section is its own kind of self-contained thing. Like you have the pit, you have the USS Flag aircraft carrier, the back alleys, forward operating base, undersea base, and these are just kind of generic things. So you can get your own map and just fit into these. Each one of these things has a thing that says people, resources, and terrain. They have plot seeds there to where if they're going to an undersea base, these are some stuff that could happen there. Overall, it's nice. It gives you, again, it's that idea of generic aspects that you can just fit to whatever you want. Yeah, it's well written. Like there really isn't a whole lot I can go through about this, but beyond saying I like it. It gives this section gives you everything you need to create some really interesting adventures for your players, like forest or jungle biome. One of the plot seeds, Dr. Mindbender, was spotted in Suriname heading south into the rainforest, accompanied by a tactical team and several botanists. Things like that. So each one of these is going to be mission based. And yeah, it gives you really everything that you're going to need to be able to do this. So I like it. It's cool. It's interesting. Moving on. Chapter 12. Threats. Again, this is significantly better written than the threat section from the Power Rangers RPG. Read this and then go back to the Power Rangers RPG, and it just makes so much more sense. It gives you it gives you your monster manual, but it also gives an explanation. Like there's a section called combining threats. Level of the threat indicates the average level of a squad of 4 PCs should be in order to defeat it. For example, Blackout is threat level 10. 4 10th level PCs should reliably be able to defeat him in combat. 4 11th level PCs should handle him with minimal issue. 4 12th level PCs may see him as an inconvenience. So they actually explain what threat means. There's actually a threat level on each one of these characters, and it actually explains what it is. It gives you kind of a formula of how to combine multiple creatures in order to create combat encounters and the things in there. Like the whole thing is just much easier to understand. And then you actually go into the threats themselves, and they start off with Cobra Commander, which actually Cobra Commander takes up 3 pages, and is threat level 20, folks. So he's a big bad dude. And then you have like the Baroness, Destro, Dr. Mindbender, and then they start going into some lower level dudes. Blackout, Firefly, Major Blood. And then they have their more infantry stuff, your Cobra recruits, troopers. And this is what I like, is they have so many more threats that you can throw at them. Because, and again, Power Rangers is a victim of its own plot. Generally, Power Rangers are always going to be fighting putties, and then I'm a big bad guy. That's not going to be happening with G.I. Joe. They're going to be fighting your grunts throughout it, and then they'll have a big confrontation with a bad guy. And named bad guys, you generally don't kill them off. Named bad guys, when combat gets real bad, they run away. Or you might capture them, and then an adventure you have to deal with later is the bad guys are going to try and break them out. Things like that. So you don't really have a monster of the week as much as you have a rogues gallery that keeps coming up. And so I just think this is better. For an RPG, I think this is better design overall. There are multiple groups. that you can deal with. Because you have Cobra, and then you have mercenaries that you can deal with as well. Like the Crimson Guard is a group of mercenaries. The Dreadnoks is another group of mercenaries that works with Zartan. The Red Ninjas are another group of mercenaries. So it gives you this really, really nice variety of creatures that you can throw and situations that you can put your Joes into. And then they have vehicles for the bad guys too, because obviously there's going to be vehicular combat. There's got to be vehicles. And again, vehicles were a big thing in G.I. Joe. Like they were cool toys. They were super, super cool toys. Just making sure I'm not missing anything. So yeah, that's the threat section, and it is a well-defined section. It is a well-written section. It's so much better. Again, I wish they had released this book before Power Rangers, because the Power Rangers book makes so much more sense than this one. It's obvious they learned from their mistakes with this one compared to what happened with Power Rangers. This is much more polished. It's just much better written. It's much more solid. If you watched my Power Rangers and you picked it up, my Power Rangers review, and you picked it up, I would almost say buy this book just so you can run your Power Rangers games better, because it is significantly nicer. And then I think about these, and this is something I do in my my D&D games, is I will reskin things. They give you 3 different flavors of putty in the Power Rangers. Here, because they give you so many different grunts, you can take a Red Ninja Striker or a Red Ninja Archer and just call it a putty. And you can literally just take the Red Ninja Archer, put it over there, and it'll still work, and just call it a putty, but you can let the putties do something a little bit different and give a little bit more of a challenge to your players than, oh, look, the putties are here. Punch, punch, punch. Yay, we win. So, yeah. Moving on. I'm just about out of water, too. I'm going to get another bottle of water. Ow. All right. Moving on. Chapter 13. Running a mission. Again, in the Power Rangers, this was not really running a mission. This is how do you run this specific mission. This one gives you a little bit more of an explanation of how to kind of build a mission, but it is still very much focused on Snake Pit, which is the introductory adventure. This is something that I still feel is missing from the Essence system thus far. It wasn't in the Power Rangers RPG. It's not in the G.I. Joe. They need a GM section. In the Player's Handbook, they did have a relatively short section that gave you a little bit of ideas about how to be a GM. And they had the basic rules, which had a much larger thing. And then they released the Dungeon Master's Guide, which gave you a much, much better idea about how to create adventures, how to create campaigns and things like that. And that simply doesn't exist here. They do have a very, very quick 6-step process of, okay, this is how you run a mission, but they don't really have any advice about how to build an adventure or anything like that, how to raise stakes, things. And I really think for the Essence 20 system, I think for each one of these adventures, they need just a chapter. They don't need an entire book on it, but just a decent, 20 pages, 30 pages where they talk about, okay, this is how you run games in this, and this is how you build adventures, and this is how you build encounters and things like that. I think that would be really, really useful. That being said, when looking at this just as a starting adventure, like I said before, I think this is a really cool adventure. It feels like your first day in G.I. Joe. It's It's cool. It's a you start off getting to the pit. This is your first day at GI Joe. They give you a tool. They give you some tasks and training things that you have to do. Some bad things happen that you have to deal with. Eventually, Cobra shows up, and you get to do that, and then it's done. Like, everything about this is cool. It's interesting. From a new player perspective and from a training perspective, they introduce everything in very small piecemeal pieces, which is nice. It allows you to very slowly introduce your character or your players to the more complicated aspects of the system, and it's a well-written introductory adventure. I can tell you from personal experience, creating an introductory adventure is a skill, and it is a skill that not everybody has, because I've seen some really, really badly designed first adventures. And the quickest way to make sure that somebody never plays your RPG again is to give them a bad intro experience. Overwhelm them with too much, take away their choice and make it too railroady. This gives you the perfect balance of, you need to give them direction, especially for new players. They're not going to really understand the idea of, I can do anything. Like, invariably, if you start someone brand new to an RPG, you will eventually get someone that you go, okay, well, what do you want to do? And they go, well, what can I do? Well, you can do anything. Oh, I can do anything? Then I'm going to run up the wall, and then I'm going to find a snake and going to make the snake my pet. It's like, no, that's not what I meant. So you do need to give them some limitations for their first adventure. But you need to make sure that it is not just this very linear path where it doesn't matter what they do, it's always going to be the exact same adventure. And this gives you that really nice balance between structure and direction, and still giving them choice. And so, yeah, overall, it's a really, really great thing. And in this section, they have new monsters as well, that are really, really nice. And again, if you want to template them, do it. It's cool. It's interesting. Everything about it is cool. They even have battle maps in here as well. Which again, I'm a huge fan of battle maps. I didn't used to be, but they can be super, super fun. And yeah, so that is the G.I. Joe role-playing game core rulebook. So, final thoughts. Overall, this is such a leap forward for the Essence system compared to the Power Rangers RPG. Like, things are significantly better explained here. The roles system is just better than the RPG or the Power Rangers system. Things make more sense now that I understand. Like, this actually made me understand the Essence system. The Power Rangers role-playing game let me get a taste for the system and got me excited for the system. This actually taught me the system. I actually feel like I could run an adventure using the system after reading this. Whereas with Power Rangers, I really felt like I wasn't ready after reading the book to run an adventure. So yeah, this is so much better than the last one. And again, I'm not even a huge G.I. Joe fan. I'm familiar with it. I know that it exists and it's cool. But I don't have the huge nostalgia like I did to do for Power Rangers. And despite the fact that I don't have a huge connection to it, I really like this system. I think it fleshes out the Essence system significantly better. I think things are explained significantly better in this than the other one. I'm now really looking forward to the Transformers because I am a Transformers fan. Specifically, I got into Transformers during the Beast Wars era. I used to love Beast Wars. I watched the entire series. I watched Beast Machines, which was the sequel series. I loved it all. I got really into the lore of it. So this makes me super excited for the Transformers one. And seeing how it's different than the Power Rangers RPG. Again, You cannot take the roles in here and use them in the Power Rangers RPG. The systems are too different. But the threats work this is the same way. The equipment and things like that works effectively. This is the same way. It's almost identical. So other than the roles themselves, these systems are very similar. And I like the fact that the roles are different enough that this is a different game. This is not just Power Rangers, the role-playing game with, machine guns instead of blasters. This is a different game, and it's a well-designed game. I'm really, really excited about this. It has definitely turned me on to G.I. Joe in general, and it's made me excited. Like I want to run a G.I. Joe campaign. I've got so many ideas about cool things that I could do. The system itself lends itself really, really well to drop in and drop out adventures. For people that have a really hard time getting people to actually show up to their Giga games, this is the perfect kind of, I can't remember what it's, I think it's called, I can't remember. Basically, it's a campaign type, it's Westlands or something like that. Basically, it's a campaign type where you have multiple DMs that run campaigns and a pool of players. And for each, or not campaigns, adventures. And for each little adventure, different players will kind of show up and be able to play in that adventure. And then, when that adventure is done, a new DM will come in and maybe a different group of players will come in. And it allows for a lot more flexibility in people that can show up. You can have 8 to 10 people that play in your Giga games, and instead of having them always have to have every single one of them show up, you can just have certain ones show up. And in the lore, it's just like, well, this week we're going to have these 4 people, and for this mission we're going to have these group of people. Like it's much easier to deal with people not being able to make every single session compared to Power Rangers, where you have a set group of players, or D&D, you have your adventuring party and you don't have people coming in and out of it. And I like that. I think that's a strength of this system. And I think that will make it significantly easier for people to play this system compared to other systems, because as long as they have a character that's the right level, they can just jump in. I think that would make for a very easy organized play system. If Renegade wanted to create an organized play system, this would work really well for that. And I would love to see another organized play system like the Adventurers League, except for G.I. Joe. I think it would work really, really well, whereas I don't think it would work for Power Rangers because the lore is too different. But yeah. Anyway, that is going to be all for me today. As always, if you enjoyed this, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, turn notifications on. All those things are super important to other people seeing this video. In the comments down below, what are you most excited about for G.I. Joe? Was there a role that stood out that you're like, oh, that sounds really cool? Was there an influence or an origin that's like, wow, that's cool? Was there other aspects? Is it the weapon upgrading or the armor upgrading? Is it the pet system? What are you most excited about for G.I. Joe? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that's all for me today, and I will see you guys in the next time, all right? Bye-bye.